racist passenger on a plane attacks a black woman sitting next to her on the plane. But she would never imagine that she was a CIA agent. The cabin pulsed with a raw electric heat as the woman's voice slashed through the drone of the engines, sharp and dripping with venom. "Get up! This is my seat!" Her manicured nails clawed into the armrest, her body thrusting forward like a predator claiming its kill. Across from her, the young black woman by the window sat still, her posture a liquid calm, her eyes half-shuttered behind thick lashes, as if the outburst were a fleeting whisper against her skin. The aggressor's face twisted, flushed with fury, her platinum hair snapping like a whip as she barked again. "I said move, now." Passengers turned, necks craning, a wave of gasps and murmurs igniting the air. Phones flashed to life, their lenses glinting like hungry eyes. The tension coiled tight, a sensual dance of defiance and power, as the young woman's lips parted, just a breath, before her hand slid into her leather jacket. In one smooth, deliberate motion, she pulled out a badge, the silver catching the light like a lover's promise, and held it aloft. "CIA," she said, her voice a velvet murmur that swallowed the chaos whole. The aggressor froze, her mouth gaping, color bleeding from her face as if kissed by frost. The cabin fell silent, a collective inhale stealing the air. "I suggest you sit down," the agent continued, her tone laced with a quiet, intimate threat, "and enjoy the flight." The words hung heavy, a caress and a warning, as the flight attendant rushed forward, her heels clicking a frantic beat. The aggressor stumbled back, her bravado unraveling like silk, while the agent tucked the badge away, her fingers brushing the leather with a tender grace. She sank back into her seat, headphones slipping over her ears as if the storm she'd summoned had never grazed her. The plane shivered faintly, a tremor of metal and sky at 30,000 feet, but the real turbulence simmered in the eyes of those watching. The aggressor, now a wilted shadow, collapsed into a seat 3 rows back, her hands trembling as the flight crew hovered, their whispers sharp with urgency. Passengers traded glances, their murmurs a low, sensual hum of awe and unease, while the agent by the window gazed out at the endless blue, her reflection a ghost against the glass. The moment had flipped, a seismic shift from disrespect to reverence, and the cabin thrummed with it, anticipation, curiosity, and a dark undercurrent of betrayal yet to surface. The story didn't ignite here, not in this charged clash of wills mid-flight. It began hours earlier, in the sultry haze of Los Angeles International Airport, where the air hung thick with jet fuel and the restless pulse of travelers. Maya Carter moved through the terminal like a shadow through smoke, her steps measured, her presence a quiet tempest. At 28, she carried secrets in the curve of her spine, her skin a deep mahogany that drank the light as she adjusted the strap of her carry-on. Her hair, a cascade of tight curls, framed a face that could seduce or shatter, depending on the tilt of her jaw. She wore a leather jacket over a fitted black turtleneck, her jeans clinging to her hips with a casual defiance. To the casual observer, she was just another passenger. But beneath the surface, she was a weapon forged in the fires of covert ops, sharp, precise, and unyielding. Nia's mission was deceptively simple: board Flight 8027 to DC, deliver an encrypted drive to her handler, and melt into the night. The drive, nestled in a hidden pocket of her jacket, held intel that could dismantle a web of arms dealers threading through the capital's shadows. She'd spent months chasing it, nights of stakeouts in rain-slicked alleys, days of feigned normalcy, her life a tightrope between passion and peril. Passion fueled her for justice, for the rush of the hunt, for the lives she guarded in silence. But betray, that was a lover she'd learned to embrace, a shadow she could never fully trust. The terminal pulsed with chaos as Nia wove through the crowd, her senses attuned to every flicker of movement. A man in a gray hoodie lingered too long by the newsstand, his eyes darting toward her before he turned away. A woman with a toddler tugged a suitcase past, her voice sharp as she scolded the child, but her glance lingered on Nia's face. Paranoia was an old friend, a whisper in her ear she'd learned to heed without flinching. She adjusted her earbuds, letting the low thrum of jazz drown the noise, and kept her pace steady. The gate loomed ahead, a beacon in the storm of bodies, and she exhaled softly as she joined the line. Her ticket scanned with a beep that echoed in her ears, a small ritual of normalcy before the plunge. She boarded early, slipping into seat 14A by the window, her body sinking into the leather with a soft exhale. The plane smelled of recycled air and faint perfume, a sensory tangle that anchored her as she pulled out her headphones. She craved the window-controlled distance, a view of the world she could hold at bay. Her fingers brushed the drive in her pocket, a ritual of reassurance, before she leaned back, letting the hum of boarding passengers wash over her like a tide. The cabin filled slowly, a parade of lives brushing past her orbit. A businessman in a rumpled suit muttered into his phone, his tie askew as he claimed 12C. The young couple giggled their way to 16F, their hands entwined, oblivious to the world beyond their bubble. Nia watched them all through half-lidded eyes, cataloging details, posture, glances, the weight of their bags. Habit, not suspicion, drove her now, a rhythm etched into her bones from years of training. She'd been 16 when the CIA first plucked her from the chaos of foster care. A girl with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, molded into something lethal. The memory flickered, her first handler, a grizzled man named Elias, his voice rough as gravel as he'd said, "You're a ghost now, Carter. Learn to live like one." Then came Vanessa Reed, the woman who had set the storm ablaze. She swept down the aisle like a queen claiming her throne, her platinum hair aflare against the dim cabin lights. At 42, Vanessa wore her privilege like a second skin. Her designer coat draped over her shoulders. Her lips painted a bold crimson that matched the fire in her eyes. She was a real estate titan. A woman who crushed rivals with a smile and a signature, her name whispered in boardrooms and feared in backrooms. But beneath the gloss simmered a hunger, a need for dominance that bordered on obsession. Her ticket read 14B, the seat beside Nia, but her gaze locked on 14A with a predatory glint. She always took the window, her view, her kingdom, and she wasn't used to yielding. Vanessa paused at the row, her eyes raking over Nia, with a flicker of contempt. "You're in my seat," she said, her voice a low purr edged with poison. Nia didn't stir, her gaze drifting up to meet Vanessa's with a languid calm. "Check your ticket," she replied, her tone smooth as satin, revealing nothing. Vanessa's lips twitched, a spark of irritation flaring as she waved her boarding pass. "I don't need to check anything. I want the window." The words hung between them, a gauntlet thrown in silk, and the air thickened with the scent of a brewing clash. The exchange could have ended there, a minor skirmish in the grand tapestry of the flight, but Vanessa pressed, her voice rising like a tide, cutting through the cabin's hum like a blade. "Get jet," she snapped, her hand slamming the armrest with a force that jolted the seat. Nia's pulse quickened, not from fear but from the thrill of the dance. She'd faced worse silenced pistols in dark rooms, traitors with honeyed lies, men who thought they could bend her. This was a gnat buzzing in her ear, but Vanessa leaned closer, her breath hot with rage, her face a mask of entitlement. "Do you know who I am? I don't sit in the middle like some nobody." The cabin stirred, a sensual ripple of tension threading through the rows. A man in 15C pulled out his phone, the camera's red light winking as he angled it toward the scene. A woman across the aisle whispered to her companion, her eyes wide with hunger for the drama. Nia felt the weight of their stares. A spotlight she hadn't sought, and something in her shifted, a flicker of steel, a choice to end this before it spiraled beyond her grasp. Her hand moved to her jacket, slow and deliberate, as Vanessa's tirade crested, "Move, or I'll have you thrown off this plane." And then, the badge. Nia drew it with a grace that bordered on seduction, the silver gleaming as she held it up, her eyes locking with Vanessa's. "CIA," she said, her voice a quiet thunder that rolled through the cabin. Vanessa's words choked mid-sentence, her body stiffening as if struck by lightning. The color drained from her face, leaving her crimson lips stark against her pallor. The passengers gasped, a collective breath that seemed to suck the air from the plane. Nia's lips curved faintly, not a smile, but a shadow of one, as she added, "I suggest you sit down and enjoy the flight." The aftermath unfurled in slow, delicious waves, a burn of consequences that rippled through the plane like a lover's touch turned bitter. The flight attendant, Clara, a petite woman with nervous hands, hurried forward, her voice trembling as she addressed Vanessa. "Ma'am, please, let's get you settled." Vanessa stumbled back, her bravado crumbling like ash. her eyes darting as if seeking an escape that didn't exist. The crew guided her to 17D, 3 rows back, where she sank into the seat, her hands gripping the armrests like anchors. The passengers watched, their whispers a sensual hum of support for Nia. Some admiring, some wary, all ensnared. Nia returned to her seat, her movements fluid, her headphones slipping over her ears with a practiced ease. She gazed out the window, the clouds a soft blur against the endless sky. But her mind churned. Vanessa's outburst had been a flare in the dark, drawing eyes she didn't want. The drive in her pocket felt heavier now, a secret that pulsed with danger. She'd bared her identity not from pride, but necessity. And the cost lingered, a betrayal of her own shadow she hadn't foreseen. Vanessa simmered in her new seat, her mind a knot of rage and shame. She'd misjudged Nia, marked her as prey, and the sting of that error burned deep. Her fingers traced the edge of her phone, a temptation to call her assistant, to unearth this agent who dared to defy her. Passion drove her. Passion for power, for vengeance, but betrayal gnawed at her too. The world she ruled, the order she trusted, had flipped in an instant, leaving her raw and exposed. Back in Los Angeles, hours before the flight, Nia had stood in a dimly lit motel room on the edge of the city, the kind of place where the walls smelled of stale smoke and the carpet crunched underfoot. She'd met her contact there, a wiry man named Javier with a scar snaking down his left cheek. He'd slid the drive across the chipped Formica table, his voice low and clipped. "This gets to DC, or we're all ash," he'd said, his eyes flicking to the window as if expecting shadows to peel from the night. Nia had nodded, slipping the drive into her jacket, her fingers brushing the cool metal of her concealed Glock as she did. Trust was a currency she rarely spent, but Javier had proven himself, 3 ops, 2 continents, no crack. Still, she'd checked the room for bugs after he left, her hands moving with the precision of a surgeon, her breath steady as she dismantled a pen to reveal a hidden mic. She'd crushed it under her heel, a small rebellion against the unseen eyes that dogged her step. The drive wasn't just data, it was a map of corruption, a ledger of names and deals that could topple empires. Arms dealers in DC had grown bold, their tendrils curling into government contracts, their profits soaked in blood. Nia had tracked them from a warehouse in Istanbul to a penthouse in Miami, her cover as a freelance journalist holding just long enough to slip through their defenses. She'd seduced a mid-level operative in a bar, her laugh a weapon as she'd coaxed passwords from his lips, her fingers tracing his arm while her mind catalogued every word. The drive was the prize, but the cost had been steep. 2 safe houses burned. A teammate lost to a sniper's bullet in Prague. She carried that weight, a silent ache in her chest, as she'd packed for LAX. Now, on the plane, that weight pressed harder. The man in 15 5C, mid-30s, wiry, with a cheap suit and a nervous tic, kept glancing her way, his phone still in hand. Nia's instincts flared, a prickle at the base of her skull. Was he just a voyeur, feeding the internet's hunger for spectacle, or something more? She shifted slightly, angling her body to keep him in her peripheral vision, her hand resting near her jacket pocket. The drive was secure, stitched into a false seam, but exposure gnawed at her. If the wrong eyes saw that video, if the wrong ears heard CIA, her mission could unravel before the wheels touched down. Across the cabin, Vanessa's mind churned with its own storm. She'd built her empire on control, every deal, every handshake, every rival crushed under her heel. Her childhood had been a battlefield, a trailer park in Nevada where her mother drank herself into oblivion, and her father vanished with the rent money. Vanessa had clawed her way out, her beauty a blade she'd wielded until it drew blood, her ambition a fire that consumed anyone who stood in her path. The window seat wasn't just preference, it was a symbol, a perch from which she surveyed her domain. To lose it to this woman, this agent, was a crack in the armor she'd spent decades forging. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she typed a message to her assistant. "Marcus, find out who she is. Seat 14A. Flight 827. CIA." She hesitated, her thumb hovering over send, then deleted it. Not yet. She needed more. Leverage. A name. A weakness. Her eyes flicked to Nia, tracing the curve of her jaw, the calm that radiated from her like a taunt. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line. She'd lost this round. but the game wasn't over. The flight stretched into its second hour, the cabin settling into a fragile calm. Clara, the flight attendant, moved through the aisle with a cart, her smile tight as she offered drinks. She paused at Nia's row, her voice low. "Water? Coffee?" Nia glanced up, her eyes softening briefly. "Water, thanks." Claire handed her a bottle, her fingers brushing Nia's with a flicker of warmth. "Thank you," she added, quieter now for keeping it under control. Nia nodded, a ghost of a smile tugging at her lips before she turned back to the window. Clara lingered a moment, her gaze tracing Nia's profile. She'd seen her share of chaos, drunk passengers, screaming babies, a fistfight over a reclined seat, but this was different. Nia carried a stillness that felt like a storm held in check, a power Clara couldn't name but felt in her bones. She moved on, her cart rattling softly, but the memory of Nia's eyes stayed with her, a quiet ember in the monotony of her shift. In 15C, the man, his name was Ethan. Though Nia didn't know it, scrolled through his phone, the video already live on X. The caption glared back at him: "CIA agent shuts down Karen on flight 87. Comments poured in, a flood of emojis and exclamation marks, a few calling for the Karen's head. Ethan smirked, his thumb hovering over the screen. He was a freelance videographer, scraping by on viral clips and odd jobs, and this was gold. He'd caught the badge flash, the shift in Vanessa's face, the ripple through the cabin. He didn't care who the agent was, only that she'd made his day. Neo felt the shift, a subtle hum in the air, as passengers stole glances her way. The video was out there. She didn't need to see it to know. Her training kicked in. A mental checklist: assess, adapt, proceed. She couldn't stop the spread, not mid-flight, but she could control her next move. She pulled out a paperback, a worn copy of The Spy Who Came In from the Cold, and flipped it open, her eyes scanning the words without reading. It was cover, a prop to steady her pulse, to signal calm to anyone watching. Inside, her mind raced, mapping the descent into DC, the handoff, the exit. Vanessa, meanwhile, stewed in 17D, her nails digging into her palms. She'd overheard Clara's whisper to Nia, the gratitude that stung like salt in a wound. The passengers' murmurs tilted toward the agent now, a tide of admiration she couldn't stem. She leaned forward, catching the eye of a woman in 16E, a middle-aged brunette with a pinched face and a gossip's Dewey Decimal System. Her lips pursed as she leaned toward Vanessa. "Did you see that?" She shut her down like it was nothing. Vanessa forced a smile, her voice tight. "Some people need to learn their place." The woman nodded itterly, oblivious to the venom in Vanessa's tone, and turned back to her companion. Vanessa's gaze slid to Nia, a plan forming like smoke in her mind. She'd find out who this agent was, dig into her shadows, and turn the tables. Power wasn't just money or status, it was knowledge, and Vanessa intended to wield it. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, a jolt that rattled cups and drew a few gasps. Nia's hand tightened on her book, her eyes flicking to the window as the clouds churned, gray tendrils curling against the blue. She'd flown through worse missions in rickety cargo planes over jungles, drops into war zones where the sky itself seemed to scream. But this felt personal, a nudge from fate. She closed her eyes, letting a memory surface. A night in Bogota, rain hammering the tin roof of a safe house, her partner, Malik, bleeding out on the floor. She'd held his hand, her voice steady as she'd lied. "You're gonna make it." He had. The drive in her pocket was his legacy, a piece of the puzzle he'd died for, and she wouldn't let it slip away. The turbulence eased, and the cabin settled again, but Nia's calm was a mask. She glanced at Vanessa, catching the woman's stare, cold, calculating, a predator licking its wounds. Nia knew that look. She'd seen it in boardrooms and back alleys, in the eyes of men and women who thought they could outmaneuver her. Vanessa didn't know the game she'd stepped into, but Nia did, and she played to win. Hours later, the plane began its descent into DC, the city's lights winking through the dusk like scattered jewels. Amelia stood, her jacket draped over her arm, the drive secure. The passengers parted for her, their gazes a mix of reverence and fear, but she felt the weight of what loomed ahead. Vanessa lingered behind, her eyes tracking Nia's every move, a vow of retribution simmering beneath her silence. The cabin emptied slowly, a procession of lives brushing past, oblivious to the storm they'd witnessed. Outside, the tarmac gleamed wet from a recent rain, the air sharp with the scent of jet fuel and damp asphalt. Nia slipped into the terminal, her steps quickening as she scanned the crowd. Her handler, a woman named Grace, with steel-gray hair and a smoker's rasp, waited by the baggage claim, her trench coat blending into the shadows. Nia handed over the drive, their fingers brushing in a silent exchange, and Grace nodded once before vanishing into the throng. Nia exhaled, the tension easing from her shoulders, but the spotlight lingered. The video was out there, her face tied to CIA, a thread that could unravel everything. She adjusted her jacket and stepped into the night, the city's pulse a familiar hum against her skin. Passion had carried her this far, but betrayal, whether from Vanessa, the system, or the secrets she bore, hovered closer than ever. Vanessa watched from a distance, her phone pressed to her ear as Marcus answered. "Dig into flight 8027, seat 14A, she said, her voice a blade. "I want everything. Name, history, weaknesses." Now, she hung up, her lips curling into a smile that promised blood. The story didn't end here, it was only the spark.